My name is Harper Mitchell. I'm 32 years old, and I just discovered that my parents liquidated my entire $1.8 million trust fund to pay for my sister's fairy tale wedding, then had the audacity to have her announce it publicly as my generous sacrifice, while I stood there in complete shock, realizing that 15 years of their lies had just destroyed my financial future. What they didn't know was that I had been quietly investigating suspicious account statements for months, and their theft was about to trigger criminal charges that would destroy their lives the same way they had destroyed mine. I've spent the last 8 years as a pediatric nurse at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, working nights and weekends to save lives while carefully budgeting every dollar because I believed my grandfather's trust fund was growing safely in my parents' hands. That money wasn't just my inheritance, it was my future, my security, and my grandfather's final gift to ensure I would never struggle the way he had during the Great Depression. The trust fund had been established when I was born, funded by my grandfather's successful construction business that he had built from nothing. He had always told me that education and hard work were the keys to success, but he also wanted to make sure his granddaughter would have a financial foundation that no one could take away from her. The original amount was $800,000, and by the time I turned 18, it had grown to $1.2 million. My parents, Margaret and Robert Mitchell, became the trustees when I reached adulthood, and they assured me the money was being invested conservatively and would be available when I was ready to buy a home or start a family. For 14 years, I trusted them completely. Every time I asked about the account balance or requested statements, they would give me vague updates about steady growth and tell me not to worry because they were handling everything professionally. When I finally pressed for specific numbers last year, they told me the fund had grown to approximately $1.8 million and would be transferred to my direct control when I turned 35, which was still 3 years away. The relationship with my family had always been complicated by their obvious favoritism toward my younger sister Chloe. While I was working my way through nursing school and building my career, Chloe was drifting through her 20s without ever holding a steady job or showing any interest in financial responsibility. She had dropped out of 3 different colleges, failed at numerous business ventures, and was currently unemployed while living with her boyfriend, Brandon Torres, who worked sporadically as a freelance graphic designer. Despite Chloe's complete lack of direction or achievement, my parents constantly made excuses for her behavior and provided financial support for her various schemes and lifestyle choices. Meanwhile, I was expected to be completely self-sufficient and never asked for help with anything, even during the difficult years when I was working multiple jobs to pay for nursing school. Have you ever felt like you were invisible in your own family? Like your achievements meant nothing compared to someone else's needs? That's exactly how I felt watching my parents pour money and attention into Chloe's chaos, while treating my career success as evidence that I didn't need their support or recognition. 6 months ago, Chloe announced her engagement to Brandon and immediately began planning what she described as her dream wedding. The plans were elaborate and expensive beyond anything that made sense given their financial situation. A venue at the prestigious Riverside Country Club, a designer gown that cost more than most people's cars, celebrity catering, and accommodations for 200 guests. When I asked how they could afford such an extravagant celebration, Chloe became defensive and vague, saying that Brandon's family was helping with costs and that they had been saving for years. The explanations never made sense because I knew Brandon's family had modest means, and neither Chloe nor Brandon had ever demonstrated the ability to save money for anything. My parents were enthusiastic supporters of Chloe's wedding plans, constantly praising her vision and attention to detail, while helping her coordinate vendors and manage logistics. They seemed completely unconcerned about the cost, and even suggested that I should contribute financially to help make Chloe's day perfect. The suggestion that I should help pay for a wedding that already seemed impossibly expensive raised red flags for me, but I assumed my parents were just being their usual supportive selves when it came to Chloe's desires. I declined to contribute, explaining that I was saving money for my own future home purchase, which would require accessing my trust fund in the next few years. That's when my parents became evasive and uncomfortable whenever I mentioned the trust fund or my plans to use it for a house down payment. They would change the subject quickly or give me vague reassurances that everything was fine and that we would discuss the details when the time comes. Their behavior was unusual, but I attributed it to their general discomfort with discussing money openly. 3 months before the wedding, I decided to request detailed statements from the trust fund account to better understand my financial position for home buying. My parents became agitated and defensive when I made this request, insisting that I didn't need to see the statements because they were handling everything appropriately, and that my constant questioning was insulting to their management of my inheritance. The resistance to providing basic financial information was so unusual and concerning that I decided to hire a forensic accountant to investigate the trust fund independently. I provided him with all the documentation I had, including the original trust documents and the limited statements my parents had shown me over the years. What he discovered would change my understanding of my family forever, and set in motion a chain of events that would destroy the people I had trusted most in the world. The forensic accountant's preliminary findings were devastating, but not yet complete when Chloe's wedding day arrived. I knew something was seriously wrong with my trust fund, but I didn't yet understand the full scope of what my parents had done or how it connected to my sister's suddenly lavish lifestyle. The wedding ceremony at Riverside Country Club was everything Chloe had dreamed of: elegant, expensive, and utterly perfect in every detail. The venue alone cost more than most people's annual salaries, and every aspect of the celebration screamed luxury and sophistication. As I watched the proceedings, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was witnessing something that should have been impossible given my sister's financial situation. During the cocktail hour, I overheard conversations between guests about the incredible generosity of the Mitchell family and how lucky Chloe was to have such supportive parents and sister. The comments were confusing because I had no idea what generosity they were referring to, and I certainly hadn't contributed to funding this extravaganza. The reception began with all the traditional elements: speeches from the fathers, toasts from the wedding party, and heartfelt words from the bride and groom about their love and gratitude. Everything seemed normal until Chloe decided to make an additional announcement that would shatter my world and expose the betrayal that had been building for months. "Before we continue celebrating," Chloe said, grabbing the microphone during a lull in the festivities, "I have to share something important with everyone here tonight." Her voice was emotional and trembling with what appeared to be genuine gratitude and love. "This perfect day, this beautiful wedding, this incredible celebration, none of it would have been possible without the most generous sacrifice from the most amazing sister in the world," Chloe continued, looking directly at me with tears in her eyes. The room fell silent as all 200 guests turned to look at me, clearly expecting some kind of acknowledgement or response. I felt my stomach drop as I began to understand that whatever Chloe was about to say was going to change everything. Harper gave up her entire inheritance, her grandfather's trust fund that was meant to secure her future, so that Brandon and I could have this perfect wedding day, Chloe announced, her voice breaking with emotion. She sacrificed her own dreams so that we could have ours, and I will never be able to repay that kind of love and selflessness. The room erupted in applause and cheers as guests turned toward me with expressions of admiration and amazement. People were calling out congratulations and praise for my incredible generosity and sisterly love. The attention and acclaim should have felt wonderful, but instead, it felt like I was drowning in a nightmare that I couldn't escape. I stood there frozen, my mind racing to process what Chloe had just announced to 200 people. She was claiming that I had voluntarily given up my $1.8 million inheritance to pay for her wedding, but I had never agreed to any such thing. I had never even been asked about using my trust fund for her celebration. Have you ever had a moment when your entire understanding of reality shifted in an instant, when you realized that people you trusted had been systematically lying to you for months? That's exactly what happened as Chloe's announcement made it clear that my parents had stolen my inheritance, and were now trying to make it look like a generous gift rather than theft. As the applause continued and guests approached me to express their amazement at my generosity, I felt like I was watching someone else's life unfold in front of me. This couldn't be happening. My parents couldn't have actually stolen my entire inheritance to pay for Chloe's wedding without my knowledge or consent. But the evidence was all around me. The impossible luxury of the celebration, Chloe's public gratitude for my sacrifice, and the guests' admiration for my supposed generosity. I managed to excuse myself from the congratulatory crowd and found my parents near the bar, where they were accepting praise from other guests for raising such a selfless and loving daughter. The sight of them basking in reflected glory for my supposed generosity while knowing they had stolen from me was more infuriating than anything I had ever experienced. "We need to talk," I said quietly, grabbing both of them by the arms and leading them toward a private area away from the celebration. Right now, the conversation that followed would expose the full extent of their betrayal and set in motion the revenge that would ultimately destroy their financial security and social standing forever. My parents' faces showed no surprise or guilt when I confronted them about Chloe's announcement. Instead, they looked annoyed and defensive, as if I was the one behaving inappropriately by questioning their decision to steal my inheritance. "Harper, you're overreacting," my mother Margaret said dismissively. "Chloe needed this wedding to start her marriage off right, and you make good money as a nurse. You don't need that trust fund money the way she needed it for this special day." The casual way she dismissed the theft of $1.8 million as overreacting was so shocking that I initially couldn't respond. They were treating the liquidation of my entire inheritance as a reasonable family financial decision, rather than a serious crime that would destroy my future security. "Mom, that was my money," I said, trying to keep my voice controlled despite the rage building inside me. "Grandfather left that trust fund specifically for me, and you had no right to spend it on Chloe's wedding without my knowledge or permission." My father Robert stepped in with the same dismissive attitude. "Harper, we're the trustees of that fund, which means we have the legal authority to make decisions about how the money is used. We decided that helping Chloe have a perfect wedding was a better use of the funds than letting them sit in an account for years." The legal justification for their theft was even more infuriating than their dismissive attitude. They were hiding behind their trustee authority to steal money that was meant to be mine, while completely ignoring the fiduciary duty they owed me as beneficiary. "Dad, you're supposed to be managing that money for my benefit, not liquidating it to pay for Chloe's lifestyle choices," I said, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. "You violated your legal obligations as trustees, and you stole money that was meant to provide for my future." We didn't steal anything," my mother said, her voice becoming more aggressive. "We made a family decision that benefited everyone. Chloe got the wedding she deserved, and you got the satisfaction of helping your sister achieve her dreams. That's what families do. They sacrifice for each other." The twisted logic of calling theft a sacrifice and claiming I should be satisfied with watching my money fund someone else's celebration was so outrageous that I almost laughed. They had literally stolen $1.8 million from me, and were now expecting me to be grateful for the opportunity to unknowingly subsidize my sister's wedding. "How much of the trust fund did you spend on this wedding?" I asked, already dreading the answer, but needing to understand the full scope of their betrayal. "All of it," my father said matter-of-factly, as if this was a reasonable financial decision rather than a devastating crime. "The wedding cost $180,000, and we used the remaining funds to pay off Chloe and Brandon's debts and help them with a down payment on their new house. We wanted to give them a fresh start in life. The revelation that they had not only spent my inheritance on the wedding, but had also used it to pay their debts and buy them a house was so overwhelming that I felt physically sick. They had liquidated my entire financial future to fund my sister's lifestyle while leaving me with nothing." "You spent $1.8 million on Chloe and Brandon," I asked, making sure I understood the magnitude of their theft. "You took every penny of my inheritance and gave it to them for a wedding, debt payments, and a house. We invested it in family happiness and stability," my mother said, clearly proud of their decision. "Chloe and Brandon needed a strong foundation for their marriage, and your grandfather's money provided that foundation. He would have been proud to see his legacy helping the family succeed." The claim that my grandfather would have approved of his legacy being stolen from me and given to my unemployed sister was so disrespectful and dishonest that I couldn't listen to any more of their justifications. "Do you know what it feels like to discover that the people who raised you are capable of systematically destroying your financial future while convincing themselves they're doing something noble?" That's exactly what I was experiencing as my parents revealed the extent of their theft and their complete lack of remorse about it. "How did you access the money without my signature?" I asked, focusing on the practical aspects of their crime rather than their twisted moral justifications. "We forged your signature on the necessary documents," my father said with no apparent shame or recognition that he had just confessed to a serious federal crime. "We knew you would eventually understand and appreciate what we did for Chloe, so we handled the paperwork ourselves to avoid unnecessary drama." The casual admission of forgery was the final piece of evidence I needed to confirm that my parents had committed multiple serious crimes in the process of stealing my inheritance. They had not only violated their fiduciary duties as trustees, but had also forged legal documents to access money they had no right to touch. "You forged my signature?" I said, wanting to make sure I had heard correctly. "You committed fraud and forgery to steal $1.8 million from me, and you think I'm going to eventually appreciate it?" "Harper, you're being melodramatic," my mother said, her patience clearly wearing thin. "We're family, and families help each other. You'll make more money in your nursing career, but Chloe only gets one wedding day. We made the right choice for everyone involved." The conversation was revealing the fundamental selfishness and entitlement that had motivated their theft. They genuinely believed that my earning potential as a nurse made my inheritance less important than Chloe's wedding desires, and they expected me to accept their financial betrayal as a reasonable family decision. "This conversation is over," I said, turning to walk away from them. "You've stolen my inheritance, forged my signature, and destroyed my financial security. There will be consequences for what you've done." As I walked away from my parents, I felt something I had never experienced before: complete clarity about what needed to happen next. They had made their choice to betray me, and now I was going to make my choice about how to respond to that betrayal. What they didn't know was that the forensic accountant I had hired months earlier had already uncovered most of their crimes, and I had been preparing for this moment long before Chloe's wedding announcement forced the truth into the open. The drive home from the wedding was the longest and most emotionally complex journey of my life. I sat in my car processing the magnitude of what had been revealed while planning the steps I would need to take to seek justice for the theft and betrayal I had experienced. The forensic accountant had been thorough in his investigation, and his final report was waiting for me when I arrived home from the wedding. The document detailed not only the liquidation of my trust fund, but also the forged signatures, fraudulent documents, and illegal transfers that my parents had used to steal my inheritance. According to the report, my parents had been systematically draining the trust fund for almost 2 years, initially taking small amounts to help Chloe with various expenses, then accelerating the theft as her wedding plans became more elaborate. The final liquidation had occurred just 6 weeks before the wedding, when they had transferred the remaining $1.6 million to accounts they controlled, and then immediately dispersed it to pay for wedding expenses, debt payments, and property purchases. But the most damaging evidence was the collection of forged documents they had created to authorize these transactions. The forensic accountant had obtained copies of the bank records and legal paperwork, showing clear evidence that my signature had been forged on multiple occasions to authorize transfers I had never approved or even known about. The criminal case against my parents was already stronger than most white-collar crime prosecutions, but I wanted to make sure they faced the maximum possible consequences for their betrayal. I had spent months preparing for this moment, and I was ready to execute a response that would destroy their financial security the same way they had destroyed mine. The first call I made was to my attorney, who had been standing by for weeks, waiting for authorization to proceed with criminal charges against my parents. The evidence of theft, fraud, and forgery was overwhelming, and he assured me that federal prosecutors would be very interested in pursuing a case that involved such clear-cut violations of fiduciary duty and banking regulations. "Harper," my attorney said during our emergency conference call that night, "the evidence we have against your parents is some of the strongest I've ever seen in a white-collar case. The forged signatures alone are enough for multiple felony charges, and the systematic theft from a trust fund will result in federal charges that carry significant prison time. The legal consequences my parents were facing were severe, but I wanted to make sure they also faced immediate financial consequences that would impact their daily lives the same way their theft had impacted mine. I want to freeze all their assets immediately," I told my attorney. "They used stolen money to pay for this wedding and to buy Chloe a house. I want every penny recovered. and I want them to face the same financial insecurity they've created for me. The asset recovery process was complex but perfectly legal, given the evidence of theft and fraud. My attorney explained that we could obtain emergency court orders to freeze bank accounts, place liens on property, and recover any assets that had been purchased with stolen trust fund money. Have you ever felt the satisfaction of knowing that justice was finally going to be served after months of betrayal and lies? That's exactly what I experienced as my attorney outlined the comprehensive legal strategy that would ensure my parents faced both criminal charges and complete financial ruin for their crimes. The timing of our legal action was carefully planned to maximize the impact on my parents and Chloe, while ensuring complete recovery of the stolen funds. We would file criminal charges immediately, but we would wait until Chloe and Brandon returned from their honeymoon to execute the asset recovery orders. I wanted them to enjoy their stolen celebration for exactly 1 week before discovering that their fairy tale lifestyle was built on criminal activity that would destroy their financial future. What kind of criminal charges are we looking at? I asked my attorney, wanting to understand the full scope of the consequences my parents would face. Grand theft, fraud, forgery, violation of fiduciary duty, and possibly racketeering if we can prove this was part of a larger pattern of financial exploitation, he replied. Your parents are looking at potential prison sentences of 10-15 years each, plus complete financial restitution and civil penalties. The severity of the charges reflected the seriousness of their crimes and ensured that they would face consequences proportionate to the damage they had caused to my financial security and trust. But criminal charges were only part of the justice I was seeking. I also wanted to recover every penny they had stolen, plus damages and interest, which would require seizing assets and potentially bankrupting people who had thought they were untouchable. The asset recovery strategy was comprehensive and designed to ensure that neither my parents nor Chloe could benefit from their theft. We would freeze their bank accounts, place liens on their properties, and recover the house that had been purchased with my stolen inheritance money. Chloe and Brandon are going to lose the house they just bought, my attorney explained, because it was purchased entirely with proceeds from the theft. They'll also be responsible for repaying all the wedding expenses and debt payments that were funded with stolen money. The consequences for my sister were severe, but appropriate, given that she had been a willing participant in spending money she knew came from my inheritance. Her tearful announcement at the wedding had made it clear that she was aware the funds came from my trust, which made her complicit in the theft, rather than an innocent beneficiary. As I finalized the legal strategy with my attorney, I felt a sense of peace and resolution that I hadn't experienced in months. The people who had betrayed me were about to discover that their crimes had consequences far beyond anything they had imagined when they decided to steal from someone they thought would never fight back. The week following Chloe's wedding was surreal, as I went about my normal routine, while knowing that federal agents were preparing to execute search warrants and asset seizure orders that would destroy my family's financial stability forever. I continued working my shifts at the hospital, caring for sick children, and maintaining my professional responsibilities while carrying the secret knowledge that my parents' world was about to collapse around them. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was saving children's lives while preparing to legally destroy the adults who had raised me. My parents called several times during the week to check in and see how I was processing the revelation about my inheritance. Their tone was patronizing and manipulative, clearly designed to gauge whether I was planning any kind of retaliation for their theft. "Harper, sweetheart," my mother called on Tuesday. "Your father and I have been thinking about our conversation at the wedding. We hope you understand that everything we did was motivated by love and family loyalty. Chloe's happiness was worth any sacrifice, and we know you'll eventually see it that way too." The continued attempts to frame their theft as a loving sacrifice were so insulting that I could barely maintain civil conversation with them. They were still trying to manipulate me into accepting their betrayal rather than acknowledging the seriousness of their crimes. "I understand exactly what you did," I replied, keeping my voice neutral despite the anger I felt. "I understand that you stole my inheritance, forged my signature, and lied to me for months about the status of my trust fund. I understand perfectly." My father also called later in the week, using a different approach that focused on family unity and the importance of moving forward together. "Harper, we're family. he said during Thursday's conversation. Families have disagreements and misunderstandings, but they work through them together. We don't want this wedding situation to create permanent damage to our relationships. Maybe we can figure out a way to make this right. The suggestion that stealing $8 million was a misunderstanding that could be resolved through family discussion was so absurd that I almost revealed my legal plans just to see his reaction. But I managed to stay focused on the bigger picture of justice and accountability. Dad, there's nothing to figure out, I said calmly. You've made your choices, and now you'll live with the consequences of those choices. Some things can't be fixed through family discussions. Meanwhile, Chloe and Brandon were apparently having the time of their lives on their honeymoon in Hawaii, posting photos on social media of their luxury resort, expensive dinners, and romantic excursions. Every image was a reminder that they were spending money stolen from my inheritance while I was working night shifts to pay my own bills. The contrast between their carefree celebration and my financial stress was exactly the kind of injustice that made their upcoming fall from grace so satisfying to anticipate. They had been living like celebrities on my stolen money, and they were about to discover what it felt like to have their financial security destroyed overnight. Have you ever counted down the days until justice would finally be served against people who had wronged you? That's exactly what I was doing as Friday approached, and my attorney finalized the timing for executing arrest warrants and asset seizure orders that would change my family's life forever. On Friday morning, exactly 1 week after the wedding that had been funded with my stolen inheritance, federal agents simultaneously executed search warrants at my parents' home and Chloe's new house, while serving arrest warrants for theft, fraud, and forgery charges. The coordination was perfect. My parents were arrested at their home while agents seized financial documents, computers, and evidence of their criminal activity. At the same time, other agents were at Chloe's house serving asset seizure orders and informing her and Brandon that their property had been purchased with stolen money and would be confiscated as part of the criminal investigation. I was at work during the arrests, but my attorney called me with updates throughout the morning as the operation unfolded exactly as we had planned. Your parents are in federal custody, he reported during his first call. They're being processed on charges of grand theft, fraud, forgery, and violation of fiduciary duty. The evidence we provided was so compelling that the prosecutor is recommending they be held without bail as flight risks. The news that my parents were in jail was both satisfying and surreal. These were people who had raised me, who had attended my graduation from nursing school, who had been part of every major moment in my life. But they were also criminals who had systematically destroyed my financial security while lying to my face for months. What about Chloe and Brandon? I asked, wanting to understand the full scope of the consequences they were facing. They're not being arrested because they weren't directly involved in the theft and forgery, my attorney explained. But they're losing everything they bought with the stolen money. The house, the cars, even the wedding expenses will all be recovered as part of the asset seizure. They're being evicted immediately and will be responsible for repaying any stolen funds they spent. The asset recovery was comprehensive and devastating. Chloe and Brandon would lose their new house, their new cars, and would be liable for repaying the $180,000 wedding expenses that had been funded with my stolen inheritance. Their fairy tale lifestyle was being stripped away piece by piece as federal agents cataloged every asset that had been purchased with stolen money. But the most satisfying aspect of their downfall was that it was happening exactly as they returned from their honeymoon, during what should have been the happiest period of their new marriage. The phone calls started within hours of the arrests and asset seizures, as my extended family began calling me to understand what was happening and why federal agents were arresting my parents and seizing Chloe's property. Harper, what's going on? My aunt called in a panic. I just heard that Robert and Margaret were arrested by federal agents. Are they okay? What are the charges? The concern in her voice was genuine, but I was done protecting my parents from the consequences of their actions. They had made choices that led to this moment, and I wasn't going to help them manage the fallout from their criminal behavior. They stole my inheritance, I said simply. They liquidated my $8 million trust fund without my knowledge or consent, forged my signature on legal documents, and used the money to pay for Chloe's wedding and lifestyle. They're being charged with theft, fraud, and forgery. The explanation was met with shocked silence as my aunt processed the magnitude of what my parents had done and the seriousness of the charges they were facing. Other family members called throughout the day with similar reactions of shock and disbelief as they learned that the generous wedding celebration they had attended was actually funded through criminal activity that had destroyed my financial future. The most dramatic call came from Chloe herself, who was apparently calling from the airport as she and Brandon tried to return home early from their honeymoon. "Harper, what have you done?" she screamed into the phone, her voice hysterical with panic and rage. "Federal agents were at our house. They're taking everything. They said our house was bought with stolen money and that we have to move out immediately." The panic in her voice was exactly what I had been hoping to hear for months as I watched her spend my stolen inheritance on luxuries she couldn't afford. Now she was experiencing the same financial insecurity and uncertainty that her theft had created for me. "I didn't do anything, Chloe," I said calmly. "Mom and Dad stole my inheritance to pay for your wedding and your house. Now they're facing the legal consequences of their theft, and you're losing the assets that were purchased with stolen money." "But Harper, we didn't know the money was stolen," she protested, though her wedding announcement had made it clear that she knew the funds came from my inheritance. "We thought you had agreed to help us. We thought it was a gift." The claim of innocence was contradicted by her own public statements about my generous sacrifice and her knowledge that the money came from my trust fund. She had been a willing participant in spending money she knew belonged to me. The conversation with Chloe revealed the full extent of the consequences she and Brandon were facing as a result of their participation in spending my stolen inheritance. The immediate aftermath of the arrests and asset seizures was chaotic and devastating for my parents and Chloe. But it was also deeply satisfying for me as I watched justice finally being served for their betrayal and theft. My parents spent 3 days in federal detention before being released on $500,000 bail each, which required them to mortgage their home and liquidate their retirement accounts to make bond. The financial strain of legal defense and bail was already destroying their economic security in ways that mirrored what they had done to me. "Harper, we need to talk," my mother called me after being released from jail, her voice completely different from the dismissive tone she had used at the wedding. "We never intended for things to go this far. Maybe we can work something out before this gets worse." The panic in her voice was genuine, and it was clear that spending 3 days in federal detention had given her a new perspective on the seriousness of the charges she was facing. But I was no longer interested in family discussions or negotiations that would minimize the consequences of their crimes. "Mom, there's nothing to work out," I said firmly. "You stole $1, $8 million from me, forged my signature, and lied to me for months. Now you're facing the legal consequences of those choices. The time for working things out was before you decided to commit multiple felonies." Meanwhile, Chloe and Brandon were discovering the practical reality of losing everything they had acquired with stolen money. The house they had lived in for less than a month was being foreclosed by federal agents, their new cars were being repossessed, and they were facing personal liability for the wedding expenses that had been funded with my inheritance. "Harper, please." Chloe called me several times during the first week after the arrests, her voice growing more desperate with each conversation. "Brandon and I are going to be homeless. We don't have any money saved because we thought the house was paid for. Can't you stop this somehow? Can't you ask the prosecutors to drop the charges?" The request that I intervene to help them avoid the consequences of their participation in spending my stolen money was exactly the kind of enabling behavior that had allowed this situation to develop in the first place. I was done rescuing family members from problems they had created through their own poor choices. "Chloe, you spent $1.8 million of my money on your wedding and lifestyle," I replied. "You knew that money came from my inheritance, and you chose to spend it anyway. Now you get to live with the consequences of that choice." The criminal case against my parents was proceeding rapidly through the federal court system, with prosecutors expressing confidence that the evidence of theft, fraud, and forgery was so overwhelming that conviction was virtually certain. "Harper," my attorney updated me regularly on the progress of the case, "your parents' lawyers are already discussing plea bargain options because they know they can't win at trial. The forged signatures alone are enough to convict them on multiple felony counts, and the systematic nature of the theft makes this a very serious case. The plea bargain discussions were focusing on prison sentences of 8 to 12 years each, plus complete financial restitution and civil penalties that would ensure they spent the rest of their lives paying back the money they had stolen from me. But beyond the criminal charges, the civil asset recovery was already returning my stolen inheritance plus interest and damages. The federal court had ordered complete restitution of the trust fund, and the seized assets were being liquidated to fund that restitution. Have you ever experienced the satisfaction of watching people who betrayed you face consequences that were perfectly proportionate to the damage they had caused? That's exactly what I was feeling as my parents and Chloe discovered that their crimes had destroyed their financial security, the same way they had destroyed mine. The house that Chloe and Brandon had purchased with my stolen money was sold at auction, generating $320,000 that was applied to my restitution. Their cars, jewelry, and other luxury items purchased with my inheritance were also liquidated and applied to the recovery of my stolen funds. But the most meaningful aspect of the justice process was watching my family members finally take responsibility for their choices, rather than expecting me to enable their irresponsible behavior. Harper, my father called me 6 months after his arrest, his voice humble and defeated in ways I had never heard before. I want you to know that I understand what we did to you was wrong. We stole your inheritance, violated your trust, and destroyed your financial security. We deserve the consequences we're facing. The acknowledgement of responsibility was something I had never expected to hear from my parents, who had historically avoided accountability for their poor decisions by making excuses and blaming others. 3 months after the arrests, the criminal case concluded with my parents pleading guilty to federal charges of theft, fraud, and forgery in exchange for prison sentences of 10 years each and complete financial restitution. The plea agreement also included provisions that would prevent them from benefiting from any assets that remained in their names, ensuring that my restitution would take priority over their living expenses. Your parents will serve their full sentences, my attorney explained during our final meeting about the criminal case. The federal system doesn't allow for early release or parole in cases like this. They'll be in prison for the next decade, and when they're released, they'll still owe you any remaining restitution plus interest. The finality of their prison sentences was both satisfying and sad. These were people who had raised me and been part of my life for 32 years, but they were also criminals who had systematically destroyed my financial security while lying to my face for months. The civil asset recovery was even more comprehensive than the criminal restitution. By the time all the seized assets were liquidated and applied to my case, I had recovered not only my original $1.8 million inheritance, but also an additional $600,000 in interest, damages, and penalties. Chloe and Brandon's situation stabilized somewhat after they both found steady employment and began making monthly payments toward their restitution obligations. The experience of losing everything and facing financial ruin had apparently taught them lessons about money management and personal responsibility that they had never learned before. Harper, Chloe called me on the first anniversary of the arrests. I want you to know that I'm sorry for my part in what happened to you. I knew the money came from your inheritance, and I chose to spend it anyway, because I wanted the perfect wedding more than I cared about your financial security. The acknowledgement of her participation in the theft was meaningful, because it showed that she was finally taking responsibility for her choices, rather than claiming to be an innocent victim of our parents' crimes. I also want you to know that Brandon and I have learned to live within our means, she continued. We both have jobs now, and we're saving money and paying bills like responsible adults. We should have been doing that all along instead of depending on stolen money to fund our lifestyle. The transformation in Chloe's attitude and behavior was remarkable, though it had taken the complete destruction of her financial security to force her to develop adult responsibility and work ethic. As I reflected on the 2 years that had passed since discovering my parents' theft, I realized that their betrayal had ultimately led to positive changes for everyone involved, though the path to those changes had been painful and destructive. My own financial security was stronger than ever, with my recovered inheritance properly invested and managed by professionals I trusted, rather than family members who had proven they couldn't be trusted with my money. I had also learned valuable lessons about setting boundaries with family members who tried to exploit my generosity or success. The pediatric nursing career that I loved had continued to flourish without the stress and uncertainty of not knowing whether my financial future was secure. I was finally able to focus on saving lives and building my career without worrying about whether family members were stealing from me or lying about my financial situation. But perhaps the most important lesson from this experience was understanding the difference between family loyalty and enabling destructive behavior. True family love requires honesty, respect, and accountability rather than blind support for poor choices and criminal activity. My parents' theft had forced me to choose between protecting myself and enabling their continued exploitation of my success and generosity. By choosing to protect myself through legal action, I had ultimately forced everyone in my family to develop healthier relationships based on mutual respect rather than exploitation. The people who had claimed to love me while stealing from me were now in prison, learning that their choices had consequences that extended far beyond their immediate gratification. The sister who had spent my inheritance on her fantasy wedding was now working to pay back every penny while learning to live within her means. And I was finally free to build relationships based on honesty and mutual respect, rather than fear that people were trying to exploit my success or take advantage of my generosity. If you're reading this and you're dealing with family members who treat your success as their personal resource while disrespecting your achievements and boundaries, please know that you have the right to protect yourself from exploitation. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for your family is to refuse to enable their destructive behavior, even when that refusal creates conflict and consequences. Setting boundaries isn't cruel. It's necessary for healthy relationships. Protecting your achievements isn't selfish. It's responsible stewardship of the opportunities and resources you've worked to build. And sometimes the people who claim to love you most are the ones who need to learn that love is demonstrated through respect rather than exploitation. If this story resonated with you, please hit that subscribe button and share your experiences in the comments below. Have you ever discovered that family members were exploiting your success or stealing from you? How did you handle situations where relatives expected you to sacrifice your security for their benefit? Your story might help someone else who's struggling with similar family dynamics. Thank you for joining me on this journey. And remember that your financial security and personal boundaries are worth protecting, even when it requires making difficult family decisions. See you in our next story here on Her Sweet Revenge.